And good morning to you all. If I haven't said it yet today, is this on? No. Is this? Yeah, it's lit up. There we go. All right. We are working this morning. All right, so our scripture reading for today. After all the hysteria in Jerusalem surrounding Resurrection Sunday, Easter Sunday, all the Jesus's body is gone. Oh my goodness, what happened? Where is Jesus? And then Jesus himself coming and going through locked doors and walking with people for miles down the roads, then vanishing into thin air again, etc., etc. After all of it has settled down and everyone's sort of thinking straight again, this group of disciples, including Peter, because it always includes Peter, they head off to Galilee. And this, like the resurrection story, the whole thing we went through on Easter morning, comparing the different readings, this is one of those places where the witness of just one gospel is incomplete in and of itself. Where you need the multiple witnesses, the multiple perspectives, in order to put the pieces together, to get a full picture of what's going on here. Because not from the Gospel of John, but from other Gospels, we know that Jesus or the angel, or the two angels, someone on Resurrection Sunday mentioned to the women that Jesus was ultimately headed back to Galilee, and the disciples should meet him there, which is what we find in our reading from Matthew today. And it makes a certain amount of sense because all of the Gospels, from them, we know that most of these men, the core disciple group, come from Galilee, including Jesus. You know, Jesus grew up in Nazareth of Galilee, his mother's hometown. And we also know that most of Jesus's actual ministry, his traveling around, visiting villages and preaching, a lot of it happened in Galilee. And in fact, a good amount of it centered around this particular body of water that we talk about in John. This lake or Sea of Tiberias, as it is called in John, it is a lake, just to be clear. It's an inland freshwater lake. It's just a really large and important lake for the people who are living in the area. So the sea of, nope. Okay. So the Sea of Tiberias, or the Tiberian Sea, just to make things... Yeah, it's out of battery. All right. Wonder what the other one is. All right. So the Sea of Tiberias, just to make things interesting. If you haven't picked up on it by now, everything in the ancient world has more than one name. So the sea is also known as the Lake Gennesaret, and it is best known as the Sea of Galilee. This is the place where you may remember in various Gospels, Jesus first meets these men, meets them in their fishing boats with their fathers and their families, carrying on the family trade as everyone just assumed they would forever. It is the place where Jesus first disrupts the lives of these men completely. Jesus turns their entire futures and every expectation they ever had in life upside down on the shores of the sea. Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Remember that call. And now, with their lives and all their expectations in life disrupted, all their expectations of Jesus completely confused and disassembled in his crucifixion and resurrection, At this point, they come back to this place, back to the beginning, to the origin story, and they come back to meet Jesus again. And at a certain point, probably waiting for Jesus to show up again and not knowing what they're supposed to be doing until he does, Peter, who is kind of always the de facto leader of this group, he looks up at the other disciples, maybe over lunch, and says, "You know what? I'm just going to go fishing." And the others kind of nod their heads and say, "Yeah, fishing. It's been a while. Let's go." You know, sometimes I think you just have to get out and do what you can do, however insignificant it might be. I think that's what the story here is all about. There, sermon over. You can all go home. Oh, obviously not. I'm still on the first page. Sorry. You know what's interesting at this point? I have heard so many sermons and so many interpretations. I've had it literally taught to me in seminary, in a class, I think it was New Testament, that this passage is about Peter and the others just giving up, just throwing in the towel and going back to their old lives because Jesus hasn't shown up yet, going back to their old careers, abandoning the call to ministry. And so then Jesus has to show up later in the passage and set them back on course. And the thing is, that really just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think we came up with that interpretation, if I had to guess. I think we came up with that interpretation because we like to see Peter as this guy who messes up a lot, kind of this buffoon. I think it's somehow comfortable for us in this day and age, by the wisdom of this age, to see the founder of Christianity, so to speak, at least, to see the first bishop of Rome, the first pope, in a manner of speaking, to see him as this bumbling person who can never get anything right and constantly has to be shoved back on course and dragged into thinking or doing the right thing. And that's why Jesus has to ask him the same question 3 times in the story. But that's not really who Peter is in the Gospels. Now, Peter is actually a good student. He's a good disciple, and he is a good leader. He's the overeager student sometimes. I've spoken about that in the past. He puts his foot in his mouth a lot. He's a human being who makes some totally understandable mistakes. But overall, he's put into the position of leadership for a reason. And I say again, I think we have this image of Peter by the wisdom of this age. I think it has become typical of us at a certain point, for whatever reason, to dwell on the character flaws of these people in the Bible. We decided we needed the people in the Bible to be relatable for some reason. And more problematic, we decided relatable means they mess up all the time. And I would just encourage us to resist this trend. You know, never say that a bad thing is good. Always admit when these people make mistakes. But we are, at the end of it all, supposed to look up to these people. They are not supposed to be just like us, really. They are supposed to be our examples. That is the point of preserving their stories. And Peter here in John is our example. He's an example of not giving up. He's not just going back to his old life because it's easy and this whole call to ministry thing is hard and he just wants to be a simple fisherman again. It doesn't really make sense, first, because in the Gospel of John, Jesus never does the whole calling the disciples out of their fishing boat thing anyway. That's not how Jesus meets Peter or the other disciples in the Gospel of John. So aside from the question of who had it right, which gospel has it right, or might they all have had it right just from different angles, what matters right now is that Peter, going back to his old pre-disciple life here, probably just is not the message that John had in mind when he wrote this story. And on the same note, the group who goes fishing with Peter includes Thomas and Nathaniel, who are not identified as fishermen. So is this even them returning to their old lives, or were they actually learning something else? And finally, the Gospels that do identify Peter and his brother Andrew as the two sons of Zebedee as fishermen, the Gospels that do identify them as that, are also the Gospels that tell us the disciples went to Galilee to meet Jesus after the resurrection. So the Gospels that might even suggest that Peter is just going back to his old life, they are the same Gospels that would suggest, like Matthew does in the reading today, that they're only out there in Galilee because Jesus told them to go there. That returning to Galilee was Jesus's idea to begin with. They're only there to meet Jesus. So no, Peter is not giving up by going fishing this day. He's doing something that should be inspiring to us. He's moving on. He's going on. He's doing what he can. He has a choice that afternoon to just sit around after lunch waiting for Jesus to show up, or to do something useful with his time, something he's good at, and also something that feeds people. We have come full circle in Jesus' story, not just geographically, but thematically. Once again, we've come back to this idea of home and food, family and food, this connection between feeding the body and feeding the soul, which is crucial to the gospel story. Jesus' miracles in the Gospels all center around, well, many of them at least, center around this theme of either healing the body or feeding the body. And like the two on the road to Emmaus that we talked about last week, the disciples today recognize Jesus in the miracle of food, of fish finally being caught. And their time together that day, like the Last Supper, is centered once again around a meal. Because eating fish for breakfast was normal back then. You know, there is some suggestion that communion, the Eucharist, this ritual that we have preserved in our churches to this day, the one that we partook in again last week, there's some suggestion that it originally included fish along with bread and wine. And that idea comes from these miracles that involve fish in the New Testament. There are several of them. Also from the use of fish as a symbol in early Christianity. Early Christians would draw the fish outside their meeting places. It's one of the ways that they would identify each other. They didn't use a cross as a symbol until later, actually. And I think there's also some vague references to fish being eaten at these meals in some early Christian documents. And then there's early Christian art, particularly tomb art, which shows a meal that includes bread, drink, and fish. And personally, I don't think that the ritual itself ever included fish, because the ritual of communion is established quite early in the Gospels, and it involves only bread and wine. And then that ritual does not change in form for 2,000 years, like at all. But it is pretty well established historically that early Christian meetings, the precursors to our modern worship services, they were based around an actual meal, an actual dinner. And if we ever wanted to bring that back, I'm all for it, by the way. But part of that dinner involved the ritual blessing of the bread and wine, which is the ritual we still celebrate today. But there were other foods at the dinner. And most often, one of those foods was probably fish, because the ancient Mediterranean diet was heavily fish and other seafood. So this association does exist in the Gospels between Jesus and his ministry and the miracles involving fish and food. It's an important symbol, and it's grounded again in this reality of feeding people, of caring for people's bodily needs, these most basic needs that all human beings share. It's a symbol that carries on all the way through to the end of our passage for this morning. Jesus' final instruction to Peter, the purpose of his whole ministry on earth, the purpose of the church that Peter is about to go on and found. Peter, this eager student whom we are supposed to look up to. The instruction is, feed my sheep. And that's what we're here for. That's what we have always been here for. It's the whole point, to feed the world. To love Jesus, to be Jesus' friend, is to take care of other people. To do what we can, even if it's just going fishing that afternoon, doing what we can do to make the world a better place, to make our own time useful and worthwhile. And by doing that, to bring the world back to God, one fish, one meal, one soul at a time. That's what Peter is demonstrating in this whole story, the willingness to act, the willingness to do that. The willingness, after everything, to keep trying, to not wait around and just hope something is going to happen, but to get back in the boat and go do whatever it is he can do. Even when it seems it's like going backwards, even when it seems so far removed from the ministry he's supposed to have, according to someone anyway, and even when for an entire night, year, decade, it doesn't seem to be paying off. To just keep at it. Because there's nothing else that's worth doing anyway. And it's the willingness to try something new too, to throw the net onto the other side of the boat when that opportunity or necessity appears, to listen to the crazy guy on the shore who tells you, no, there's fish just on the other side. Now, a lot has been said about the ending of this passage, the ending of the story here, about how Jesus asks Peter this question, do you love me, 3 times? How Peter has to answer 3 times. Also, how the words in our English translations are a bit deceptive. The word that is translated just love here is actually 2 different Greek words. One means love. The other could be translated as, I am your friend, or are you my friend? How Peter gets annoyed at having to answer 3 times. How it all harkens back to Peter denying Jesus 3 times earlier in the story. And that is definitely a parallel that exists. And maybe someday I'll preach a sermon on all of that. But for today, to close in these few minutes before we go to our next song, I just want to highlight the fact that it is 3 times, 3 questions, 3 answers. It is a pattern of 3. And here's something that I have learned as a writer, as taught to writers quite a lot. There is something about the number 3. There is something about saying something 3 times, about putting a point into a 3-part pattern. And they teach this in writing classes, they teach it in copywriting classes, also known as advertising. The basic structure of all ads, all persuasive ads, is the same. It's presentation of the problem, amplification of the problem, presentation of the solution. All ads. That's how they do it. That's how they get you to buy stuff. Because it works. Even when you know that's what it's doing, what they're doing, it still works. Narratives do the same thing. Every story follows the same basic pattern, which is beginning, middle, end, or the fancier terminology is inciting incident, climax, resolution. Every piece of nonfiction writing, every essay, persuasive argument, court case, follows the same pattern. It's an introduction or an opening statement, the body, the presentation of evidence, and the conclusion or the closing statement. This is worldwide. This is every story. It's every argument. This is how the human brain works, in patterns of 3. Repeating something 3 times. It really is the magic number. The actual evidence points to that being the case. We drive our points home in patterns of 3. And as Christians, we also know God to be 3, triune, 1 in 3 persons. There is something to that goes very deep in the human psyche. And I guess my point in all that, for this morning at least, is that when you find patterns of 3 in the Bible, there are a lot of them, and they will probably draw your attention just naturally because that's what they do. But if you do notice them consciously, pay extra attention, because this is probably a very important point that's being made. Jesus drives the point here home in a pattern of 3. Love me, take care of my people. Love me, take care of my people. Love me, take care of my people. That's what it's all about. In Matthew today, our reading from Matthew, we had the Great Commission. Go into all the world, preach the gospel, make disciples. That's a pattern of 3, by the way. It's the same thing that Jesus says here to Peter, except his words to Peter are about how we actually go about doing that. It's not about beating people over the head with evidence, proving our point. How do we make disciples? We feed them. We be examples of what following Jesus means, examples that people can see, examples that inspire as we have been inspired by these stories that have gone before us, stories like Peter's. People who walk in the light, who just keep moving forward in the light. The type of person we are now going to sing about in our next song. The more I read this story at the end of John, the more I see the entire story as a parable to illustrate Peter's answer to Jesus here. The answer that, yes, I am your friend. I will follow. I will continue to follow. From the start, back to the start, and beyond. Because yes, I want to walk as a child of the light, which is our next song. It's number 206 in the hymnal.